discuss with you a topic that's been coming up more and more with a number of farmers in my area, and that's factors to consider when selecting a new wheat variety or considering if you should move to a new wheat variety on your farm. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Samantha Ludwig. I'm the Market Development Agronomist covering the Camrose, Leduc, and Edmonton areas. So I may have met some of you, but maybe not everybody just yet, as I started just before COVID hit. So there are a number of key traits to consider when you're looking at what wheat variety fits best on your farm. Obviously, yield is something that's going to come into play, and a lot of that is in the genetics, as well as some other factors like managing your fertility appropriately and crop rotation. Maturity in our area is very important as we have a short growing season. And then obviously, protein on the marketing end is very important. And then lodging, sprouting, and disease and insect resistance can also be very important depending on the area that you're in. So I'll touch on the majority of these in a little bit more detail and kind of what to look for. So starting with maturity, it's really important to choose a variety that has a maturity to fit the area. Thankfully, there are a number of varieties that fit this northwest central Alberta area quite nicely. Some are earlier than others, but there is a large number to choose from. But there are other factors that can affect your maturity, such as the critical weed-free period at the beginning of the crop's life. Typically, wheat isn't very competitive with other plants from germination up to 3-leaf. So during that time, it's really important to keep your fields as weed-free as possible. So early season weed control can really help with that maturity. If the plants are already competing with other weeds, other volunteer crops before the 3-leaf stage, it can set them back in their maturity. Plant population can also affect maturity. So it's important to target a plant population when you're seeding of 28 to 35 plants per square foot based on the TKW of the seed. A low plant population, for an example, can lead to a lot more tillers. And tillers can also come in a really wet year like we've seen this year where we had just an extended tillering period. But those tillers can extend maturity of your overall crop and lead to more green seed. Another really important factor in your maturity is your germination and your vigor of your seed. It's important to have the seed tested to determine if its germination potential and vigor will work well under our stressful seeding conditions. The lab values that we're given are under optimal conditions, which we rarely see at harvest. So when you throw more stress, environmental stress, cold soils, at that seed, it can affect the germination and vigor a bit. So you want to make sure that your germination on your test report is above 85% and your vigor is above 75%. And you really want to see that there's no more than a 10% difference between those two values. So protein obviously is very important when it comes to marketing grain at the end of the year. Many end users of wheat products, wheat flour, they want that higher protein content that makes our grain so fantastic. So plant genetics can play into that. Some varieties are more naturally have a higher protein than others, but weather conditions can play into. Obviously, that's out of our control. In cool, wet years, often we'll have a lower protein content, but a higher yield. In warm and dry years, often yields will be slightly reduced, but then you'll end up with higher protein. So one way that this can be managed on farm is with proper fertility. So balancing your nitrogen and sulfur is very important. And also considering maybe split applications of nitrogen. Protein begins to be built after that flag leaf timing, and as the plant is heading out. That nitrogen used by the plant will go straight into the head and building that protein profile. So often, depending on weather conditions, split applications of nitrogen, whether that's through dribble banding or side banding, or using a foliar product, or even using a certain percentage of ESN in your fertilizer blend, can help continue to feed that plant nitrogen when it needs it to increase protein. And like I said, don't forget about sulfur. Having a proper nitrogen to sulfur ratio, and this depends on your soil a bit, but typically between 8:1 or 10:1 is really important to make sure that you're building protein appropriately. If you don't have adequate sulfur available to your plant, it does hinder protein development in the kernels. Something else that can help is crop rotation. There have been a number of studies done that have shown that wheat following a pulse or legume that's nitrogen fixing will help with increasing protein just because there's more nitrogen available in the soil. So next, this was more of an issue last year and in some areas this year that we're experiencing higher amounts of wheat midge damage. Sprouting can be seen. So what happens is moisture enters the kernel either through a prolonged rainy or damp period at harvest while the crop is still standing, or while it's in a swath. Even if it is drier, if there's a lot of moisture in the soil, it can provide that nice damp condition for the seed to think that it's time to germinate, and that causes sprouting. So essentially, the kernel is breaking dormancy, and then an alpha amylase enzyme is released, which causes a breakdown of starch at the same time and reduces the quality of those kernels. And then that starch that's converted to sugar starts growing the new plant. So the reason that this isn't ideal is that flour with high levels of amylase hold less water, so more flour is required in being used for baked goods. The dough is also more difficult to handle, and the texture of the finished product is much gummier. So this is determined by falling numbers, which many would have seen in grain analysis reports last year. So this is a flour blend is created and a slurry is made, and then it times the length it takes for a rod to fall down a tube and determines how much that starch is broken down. So the target is to be above 350 seconds because then it means that there's enough starch in the kernel for good quality flour. So another issue that comes up year after year is lodging. So lodging can be helped quite a bit by seeding rate, by not accidentally overseeding, also by balancing your fertility overall so that your plant has all of the nutrients it needs to build really strong cell wall structure in the stalks. Genetics can play a role in this as well, as some varieties naturally have better standability and better stalk strength. Often plant height can play into it, so very tall varieties tend to lodge more, but again, there are other factors that play into that too. So one useful tool that's been coming out on the market is PGRs. So the image that's up right now, this field had a PGR applied to it at the appropriate time and rate, and the area that was untreated yielded 10 bushels an acre less, and harvest overall was much more difficult. So again, that can be a useful tool if it's needed. So another factor is disease resistance. And all varieties have a rating for these diseases for loose smut, for bunt, stripe rust, leaf spots, and fusarium head blight. And I'll touch on fusarium head blight in the next slide. So in the images on your screen here, unfortunately, I don't have any really great pictures of loose smut in wheat. So the picture on your screen is in barley, but it does affect barley and wheat. And this is where crop rotation can come into play as well. Many of these diseases affect other cereal crops. And so you want to make sure that you're giving enough time for that disease to break down so that you're not building a higher load in your field by having too many cereals one after the other. So one that's come into focus more is Fusarium head blight or Fusarium graminearum. So if you're sending your seed off to be tested, it's also really, really recommended to have it tested for disease. So there are two tests that are done at the lab for Fusarium. The first is a plate test. So that determines if Fusarium, there are multiple species, if Fusarium is present on the seed. If more than 14% is detected on the seed, it is really important to find a new seed source. Even with a fantastic seed treatment, you have too much, you're introducing too much disease into your field, and it's much better to look for a new source. DNA testing will then determine if Fusarium graminearum is present and the level of infection. So if you see more than 5% detected, again, find a new seed source. Fusarium can cause early season head blight, and then Fusarium graminearum will cause Fusarium head blight, which creates a vomitoxin or a DON toxin in the seed, and this DON toxin is harmful to people and animals. For people, there is a zero tolerance, and for animals, depending on the animal you're feeding out to, the level part per million. So again, it's really important that you're getting that seed tested just to stay ahead of it. And this is even more important now as legislation in Alberta changed this past summer to allow for higher levels of Fusarium graminearum to be detected in the seed for it to be planted, which is great because it'll allow us to have new seed sources coming in from other locations. But it also means that we really need to be proactive and managing ahead of it coming to this area so that we don't have issues like other areas of Canada have had where they have widespread Fusarium head blight problems that they're struggling to stay ahead of. So something that, especially more in the Camrose area, that became a problem this year was wheat midge. So wheat midge are small orange insects, and they're very hard to see, but it's best to scout the field at early head emergence and later in the evening because they often come out to feed when it's calm and starting to cool off in the evening. Their threshold amount, if you see them on your wheat heads, count how many adults you see per 10 heads. If you see one adult per 10 heads, then that's the economic threshold for spraying. It's important to note that often wheat midge stay in headland areas and will then migrate into the center of the field. So if you do hit that economic threshold and are spraying for them, you can also look at just doing more of a spot control of areas where you're seeing them. It's also really important to remember that this chemical control is just controlling females as they're flying. So you want to be scouting early before they're laying eggs because it's control will not kill the eggs. So if the eggs are already laid, then you will have damage from those larvae when they emerge from their eggs. It's also important to keep in mind that those same chemicals that target and kill wheat midge will also kill beneficial insects. So again, that's where spot spraying can come into play. Wheat midge love areas with high organic matter, and they love humid, calm conditions, which this year we had a lot of. And so what happens is often the wheat midge will break through the kernel of, through the outer layer of the kernel and allow moisture to come in, which causes sprouting. So it degrades quality on multiple different aspects. Thankfully, there has been a big push for midge tolerance within wheat varieties. So if you're looking specifically for a midge-tolerant varieties, there's a really fantastic list. This isn't a comprehensive list of what's on the market right now, but it's a fairly representative list. And there's a larger list at midgetolerantwheat.ca. So when it comes to growing insect-resistant varieties, it's also important to plant a refuge variety along with it. So refuge plants are susceptible varieties, so in this case to midge, that help reduce the chances that the insects will overcome the resistant genetics in the subsequent generations. So typically for midge-tolerant varieties, there will be a 10% refuge component included when you purchase the seed. When you're growing a midge-tolerant variety, a stewardship agreement needs to be signed with the retail, and you need to purchase new seed every 2 years to make sure that you're not having a genetic breakdown as you increase the generations of the crop. So this is just a really, really fantastic guide that you can check out online. It's the Alberta Seed Guide. So they run variety trials across multiple different crops, and they list the results. So this is Alberta focused trials, and it's a really great resource to see a wide number of wheat varieties and what they're rated for and what their agronomic characteristics are. So I've gone through and pulled out some of the more common varieties that are grown in this area, and I've also included a few new varieties that have recently been registered to grow in the next cropping season. So in Alberta, Carberry is considered the check or the standard to compare all of the wheat varieties to, at least for hard red. There's a lot of Brandon grown in the area, and it's a very, very solid variety. It has a good yield. The maturity is a good fit for this area. The protein is all right. It's a fairly good mid-height. It's rated good for lodging. Unfortunately, it's rated poor for sprouting. So in years like last year, where there was a lot of sprouting in Brandon wheat, it's just much more susceptible to have moisture get into the kernel. And it's also moderately resistant to Fusarium head blight. At this point in time, there is no wheat variety that has full resistance to Fusarium head blight, but it is being worked on. So a moderate resistance is a good rating. Viewfield is another very common variety grown. It stands a little bit shorter. It yields typically a little bit more than Brandon or Carberry. It's rated very good for lodging. Often it has a bit of a lower protein potential though, and it's rated good for sprouting and intermediate for Fusarium head blight. So for varieties that are rated intermediate, you want to be keeping on top of your management plan for Fusarium head blight, which may include spraying. And this is something I forgot to mention earlier, sorry. If you're spraying your crop for Fusarium head blight, if conditions are right for it, it's important to spray before you're seeing any signs of it. If you see signs of fusarium head blight, it's too late. You need to spray at that early head timing to protect the head during flowering. Another great variety is red berry. It yields a little bit better than Brandon typically. It's a bit earlier. Its height is fairly similar. It's rated good for lodging and sprouting and intermediate for fusarium. Tisdale is another good option. It doesn't yield quite as much as Brandon, at least in field trials, but it's a little bit on the earlier side and has a bit of a better protein profile. It stands quite a bit taller, so it's rated fair for lodging, fair for sprouting, but it is moderately resistant to fusarium. So the next three varieties I'll mention, they all have VB at the end, which indicates that they're a midge-tolerant variety, like I mentioned. So CDC Landmark has been out for a couple years now. Its refuge is 10% view field. Its yield is typically 106% of what Carberry is. It's a little bit earlier. Its protein is fairly similar. Its height is fairly similar. And it's rated good for lodging, sprouting, and intermediate for fusarium. So the two new varieties on the market right now are Leroy and Wheatland. Leroy is earlier than Carberry and Brandon. Right now, they're saying it has slightly lower protein potential as well as Wheatland. Leroy is quite a tall variety, but it is rated good for lodging. It's rated good for sprouting, and it's moderately resistant to fusarium head blight. I have talked to a few producers who have grown this recently this year, just very small amounts as it wasn't registered, and the seed all has to go back to the retails for seed production. But what they've seen in the field is that it yields much more than 106% of Carberry, and they were really, really impressed by it. And again, it has that early maturity. Wheatland yields a little bit less than Leroy. It has a similar maturity to Carberry or Brandon. Like I mentioned, a similar protein potential. It's similar height to Brandon. It's rated very good for lodging, good for sprouting, and intermediate for fusarium head blight. So those are some of the, I guess, top varieties that tend to be grown in this area. Obviously, there's a very long list of what's grown, and this is just a very short snapshot. I've heard quite a bit recently about producers moving away from varieties like Go or Much More. So those are also being grown, but it seems like more and more there's a switch to Brandon or some other newer midge-tolerant varieties. So that's all I had to present on today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or your local Cargill rep, and we'd be really happy to assist you with any questions you may have, or help with building fertility plans or planning in-crop chemicals for you to get the most out of your wheat crop this 2021 growing season.